Somewhere in the Ötztal Alps, on the border between Austria and Italy, two hikers descended a glacier on a September afternoon in 1991 and found a body in the melting ice. They assumed it was a recent climbing accident. The cold, the silence, the shape half emerging from the glacier told them nothing otherwise. Then the researchers arrived, and the story began to come apart. This was not a recent death. The man in the ice had been there for 5,300 years, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. For 3 decades, scientists have circled one question. What killed him? The leading theory said murder, an arrow to the shoulder, a blow to the head, an ambush in the high Alps. Then new imaging technology arrived, and the case reopened. The verdict that had held for years began to unravel. This is what the science finally revealed. September 19, 1991. 2 German hikers named Helmut and Erika Simon were making their way down from a high pass in the Ötztal Alps when they saw something dark in the melting ice. At first glance, it looked like trash, the kind of debris that appears on glaciers as the ice retreats in late summer. They moved closer. What they saw was the upper half of a human body, leathery and brown, protruding from the glacier at an odd angle, face down, arms twisted beneath it. They assumed it was a recent death, a climber perhaps, caught in a storm the previous season. They reported the find, and over the following days, a recovery team arrived to extract the body from the ice. The work was difficult. Jackhammers were used. The body was damaged in the process. Nobody yet understood what they were dealing with. The assumption held, even as the recovery unfolded. A modern death, a tragic accident, a body that would be identified, mourned, and returned to family. Then the tools appeared. Near the body, embedded in the ice, lay a copper axe, a flint dagger, fragments of clothing made of hide and woven grass. The archaeologists who were called in began to understand that something else was happening here. The clothing was wrong. The tools were wrong. The man in the ice did not belong to the 20th century. Radiocarbon dating gave the answer, and the answer changed everything. The body was 5,300 years old. The man had died around 3,300 BCE, in the late Copper Age, in a Europe that had not yet built Stonehenge, in a world that would not see the rise of the Egyptian pyramids for another 7 centuries. He had lain in that ice since before the invention of writing anywhere on the continent. The glacier had held him across the entire span of recorded European history and then quietly given him back. The world gave him a name, Ötzi, after the mountains that had hidden him, the Ötztal Alps. It is a name that has become familiar to anyone who has read about the Iceman in the decades since, but it is worth pausing on the strangeness of it. A man who lived before any of us could have imagined a name existed, who knew himself only by whatever sound his people had used for him, now carries the name of the range that became his grave. The physical man began to come into focus as researchers worked on the remains. He was around 45 years old at the time of his death. He stood about 5 feet 3 inches. His skin carried tattoos, dozens of them, clustered around his joints and along his spine. His body was lean, weathered, shaped by a life spent outdoors at altitude. And the question that would haunt the next 3 decades began to take form. How had this man ended up dying alone on a mountain pass? To understand who Ötzi was, the researchers had to look past the body and into the genes it carried. DNA analysis placed him in a lineage known as haplogroup K1F, a maternal line that has since become vanishingly rare. His closest modern genetic relatives live on the island of Sardinia and in pockets of the Caucasus Mountains, thousands of miles from the pass where he died. This was not a man whose people had always lived in the Alps. He belonged to the great Neolithic migration, the long, slow wave of farmers and herders who had moved across Europe in the millennia before him, reshaping the continent as they went. He was a distant echo of that wave, living on the edge of its reach, high in a landscape where farming still mixed with older ways. His clothing told the rest of the story. Every layer he wore had been made by handmade stitching from the animals his people knew. His leggings were cut from domesticated goat leather. His loincloth was sheepskin. His outer coat had been woven together from strips of goat and sheep hide, arranged in a pattern that must have taken days of patient work. On his head sat a cap of bearskin. On his feet, shoes that deserve a moment of their own. The soles were bearskin. The uppers were deer hide. The inside was packed with soft grass netting for insulation against the snow. Leather straps held the whole construction together. They were built for cold, for rough ground, for the kind of wawing Ötzi had been doing for years. Then there was the gear scattered around him. A copper axe, its head bound to a U-handle with leather and birch tar. In his world, a copper axe was not an ordinary tool. It marked him as someone of status, someone whose community had access to metal in a time when metal was rare. He carried a flint dagger with an ash wood handle, sheathed in a woven grass scabbard. A yew longbow taller than he was, unfinished, still being worked. A quiver made of chamois hide holding 14 arrows, only 2 of them finished with flint heads and fletching. The rest were shafts in progress, being prepared in the days before his death. The rest of his kit reads like the inventory of a man who knew how to stay alive in difficult country. Birch bark containers, one of them holding embers carefully wrapped in maple leaves to keep fire alive on the move. Tools for sharpening flint. A woven grass mat, possibly a cloak for weather. Medicinal fungi threaded onto leather straps, likely used as antibiotics or tinder or both. This was not a lost traveler caught out by bad luck. This was a woodsman, a hunter, a survivor, fully equipped for the mountains and fluent in them, which makes what happened to him even harder to explain. The clothing and the gear told the story of how Ötzi moved through his world. His body told the story of what that world had done to him. Researchers mapped his skin and counted around 60 tattoos, small clusters of lines and crosses inked into his flesh. They were not decorative in the way modern tattoos are decorative. They sat over his joints, along his lower spine, across his knees and ankles, in the places where his body would have hurt. The leading theory is that they were therapeutic, a form of early medical practice, pain relief marked permanently into the skin. If that theory holds, Ötzi carries the oldest known evidence of tattooing for medical purposes anywhere in the world. His stomach, remarkably, had preserved his final meal. Researchers identified ibex meat, eaten within hours of his death. Einkorn wheat, an early domesticated grain. Traces of fern. The fern is a puzzle. Some suggest he ate it for its medicinal properties. Others think it was used to wrap food, the way modern people use foil or leaves, and that he swallowed fragments along with his meal. Either way, the final hours of his life included a proper sit-down meal, eaten in enough peace that he chewed and swallowed a full stomach of food. Whatever came for him next, he did not see it coming at the time he ate. His body also carried the record of his health, written into the cells that the ice had preserved. He was lactose intolerant, unable to digest the milk that his pastoral culture had come to rely on. He carried the oldest known case of Lyme disease ever found in a human being, the bacteria still detectable in his tissue after more than 5,000 years. His joints had been worn down by decades of hard walking. Arthritis in his neck, arthritis in his lower back, arthritis deep in his right knee. His lungs were blackened, likely from years spent near open fires in enclosed spaces without ventilation. His intestines were infested with whipworm parasites, a common burden for people of his era. The fingernails, of all things, turned out to be one of the richest records. Fingernails grow slowly and steadily and preserve in their layers the chemical signature of the body's stress. Researchers examined his and found lines indicating periods of significant physical stress or illness in the months leading up to his death. Something had been wearing him down long before he climbed the mountain. Whether illness, starvation, fear, or all three, his body had been under pressure for some time. A picture emerges of a man who lived robustly and hard, who worked his body into middle age in a world that would have considered 45 old, who carried injuries and infections and chronic pain through his daily life. None of these conditions killed him. He was not dying of disease when he reached that pass. Something else finished the work, and that was the question no one could answer. For the first decade after his discovery, the question of how Ötzi died sat open. Researchers worked on the body, cataloged the gear, dated the tissue, mapped the tattoos. The cause of death remained unclear. The body showed no obvious killing wound. The gear was intact. The story of those final hours on the mountain refused to come into focus. Then in 2001, 10 years after the hikers found him, a radiologist ran advanced imaging on the body and saw something no one had noticed before. A small, dense shape buried deep in Ötzi's left shoulder, just below the collarbone. A stone arrowhead. It had entered from behind, driven deep into his back, and lodged in the tissue near the shoulder blade. The discovery rewrote everything. Ötzi had not simply died on the mountain. Ötzi had been shot. The theory formed almost immediately, and it formed with cinematic force. Ötzi had been hunted. Someone had come up behind him and released an arrow that pierced a major blood vessel. The shoulder wound had bled heavily. He had died where he fell, in the snow, within minutes. The arrow had killed him, and it had killed him fast. Picture hardened when researchers found further injuries on the body, depressions and fractures on his skull, interpreted as the marks of a severe blow, perhaps from a club or a heavy blunt object. A deep cut on his right hand, healed only partially, suggesting a defensive wound taken within days of his death. A pattern formed. Ötzi had been in a fight before he reached the mountain. He had escaped, bleeding, and climbed to high ground. His attackers had followed. They had caught him on the pass. The arrow had come first. The blow to the head had finished him. It was a compelling narrative, and it answered the question that had held the investigation back for 10 years. Ötzi became a murder victim, the oldest cold case in history. The story moved beyond the academic papers and into the wider world. Documentaries retold it, museum displays presented it, textbooks carried it. Ötzi the warrior, Ötzi the fugitive, Ötzi brought down by his enemies in the snow. The theory had the weight of physical evidence behind it. An arrowhead in the body, fractures on the skull, a defensive wound on the hand. The timeline fit, the injuries fit, the setting fit. For nearly 2 decades, this was the accepted version of events, and it settled into the record as the solved case. The Iceman had been murdered in the High Alps, and forensic archaeology had reached back across 5,000 years to piece the crime together. But science does not let cases stay closed for long. New imaging technology was already coming. New forensic techniques were already being developed. And when a new team looked at the body with tools that had not existed in 2001, they saw something that did not match the story at all. The team came from the University of Zurich, and they brought a different generation of tools to the body. High-resolution CT scans capable of resolving structures at a level the original imaging had not been able to reach. Detailed forensic pathology developed in modern trauma medicine. Analytical techniques that had not existed when the arrowhead was first discovered in 2001. They were not looking to overturn the murder theory. They were looking to understand the wounds more precisely. What they found forced the story to be rewritten. The arrow came first. The new scans allowed the researchers to see the path of the stone point through the tissue with a clarity the earlier imaging had lacked. The projectile had entered the back and lodged near the shoulder blade, as everyone had known. But the depth of penetration turned out to be shallower than the original interpretation had assumed. The arrow had ruptured a blood vessel, yes. It had caused bleeding, yes. But it had not severed a major artery. It had not opened the kind of wound that empties a body in minutes. The numbers were striking when the team calculated them. The total internal bleeding from the arrow wound was estimated at around 100 milliliters, roughly half a cup. It was enough to cause significant pain, enough to leave his left arm weakened or useless, enough to slow a man down in rough country. It was not enough to kill him. Not quickly, not by itself. The wound that the murder theory had built its entire case around turned out to be serious but survivable. Painful, debilitating, but not the kind of injury that explains how Ötzi ended up dead on a mountain pass. Then came the head injuries, and the new imaging told a different story there as well. The fractures and depressions on his skull, once read as the marks of a targeted strike from another person, looked different under high-resolution analysis. The pattern was more consistent with an accidental fall than with a deliberate blow. Ötzi had been wearing his bearskin cap when he died. The fur would have softened the impact of a headlong tumble on rocky alpine ground. The injuries were significant. They may well have left him dazed, but they did not look like the work of an enemy standing over him with a club. The two pillars of the original theory began to fall away. The fatal arrow was not fatal. The finishing blow was not a blow at all. What had been presented for 2 decades as a clear-cut case of murder in the High Alps was suddenly a case with no cause of death. The wounds existed. The conflict had been real. Someone had shot him. Something had struck his head, but neither injury, examined with modern tools, looked sufficient to explain what had happened on that pass, which left one question wide open. If these wounds did not kill Ötzi, what did? The answer the researchers arrived at is stark enough that it reframes every image anyone has ever held of Ötzi's final moments. He froze to death. Hypothermia, not homicide. The mountain killed him, not the arrow, not the blow, not the enemy who had chased him up the pass. The cold did the work that neither weapon had been able to finish. The reconstruction of those final hours, when the team pieced it together, reads differently than the murder story ever had. Ötzi was wounded. The arrow tore through his back and left his left arm weakened, possibly useless. He was bleeding, though not heavily. He may have been dazed from a fall, his head throbbing where he struck the rocks. He was high on a pass near the peak of a mountain, well above the tree line, in thin air and punishing cold. Whatever drove him up there, whether a chase or a flight or a decision made in panic, he was now stuck, unable to move quickly, unable to descend before the weather turned, unable to find the kind of shelter that might have kept him alive through a night at altitude. And the weather turned. It does that in the Alps, fast and without warning. Cloud rolled in, temperatures dropped, wind rose. Ötzi, already wounded, already weakened, already injured in a fall, found himself exposed on a ridge with nothing between him and the cold but the clothing he wore. His body began to do what bodies do in those conditions. His core temperature began to drop. His blood pulled inward toward the organs that needed it most. His extremities went cold. His thinking began to slow. Hypothermia is a quiet killer. It does not arrive with violence. It arrives with confusion, with drowsiness, with a creeping loss of coordination. The victim often does not understand what is happening. They sit down to rest. They close their eyes. They believe they will get up again in a moment. They do not. Researchers estimate that Ötzi succumbed within a window ranging from a few minutes to a few hours after becoming immobilized in the freezing conditions. Either way, the ending was slow, painful, and lonely. A death that unfolded over time rather than arriving in a single stroke. It is a harder scenario to sit with than the murder story ever was. A clean killing is over quickly. Ötzi's death was not. He had time to understand what was happening. He had time to know that no one was coming for him. He had time to feel the cold take him, piece by piece, on a ridge he could not leave. The conflict was still real. Someone had shot him. That question does not go away. But the cause of death shifts from murder to something older and more indifferent than any enemy. The mountain had taken him, and the mountain had kept him for 5,000 years. Return to the ridge, the cold, the silence. 5,300 years is almost impossible to hold in the mind. Empires have risen and dissolved in that time. Languages that once covered continents are now known only to specialists. And yet, on a pass between Austria and Italy, one man endured. Not because anyone chose to preserve him, not because any scribe recorded his story, because the mountain took him and kept him. The science has moved closer to the truth of how he died. A wound that did not kill him, a cold that did. A final hour spent alone on a ridge he could not leave. But the man himself, the life, the fear, the last climb, remains beyond the reach of any scan. Ötzi is no longer just a murder victim. He is a messenger from a world before writing, carrying a story the ice is only beginning to tell.